Unit 11, Part 2. So the first thing you need to be able to do is to recognize certain English sentences as quantifier sentences, okay? And be able to clearly distinguish quantifier sentences from singular sentences, first of all, and also from propositional functions. It's one of the sections here. Unit 11, distinguishing section 1C is quantified sentences, singular sentences and propositional functions, learning to distinguish them, very possibly something to be tested on, right? You'll be presented with some string of words and you'll be asked to identify whether it's a propositional function or a singular sentence or a quantifier sentence. And if it's a quantifier sentence, whether it's an existential sentence or a universal sentence. So be aware, so the first thing to be clear on is that there is this, there are these expressions in our language which are quantifiers, which do not name an individual, don't name a class, but speak to how many things of which the propositional function is true. Unit 11 starts on page 212. So when you're introduced to the real content here, this is page 213. Unit 11. So just here's a bunch of sample quantifier statements, right? Everything has a purpose, right? So you have to hear that. Everything has a purpose. Recognize that it doesn't have a subject, right? The word everything, the expression everything, is a quantifier. You have to be able to identify it as a quantifier, right? It's not saying there is this individual and his or her name is everything and he or she has a purpose. No, it's saying rather, right? It has a different function in the language. It is speaking to of how many things the propositional function is true. And it's saying that it's true of all things. Everything has a purpose. Everything has a purpose, right? Another important point, in English, there is a wide range of expressions which count as quantifiers. Words like most of you will pass, I hope. Almost all, right? Almost all. These all have various, a few things. So another one from this list: a few things are incomprehensible. Right? Something dug up the strawberries. I'll come back to that one. So there's a whole bunch in English, and they a whole bunch of quantifier expressions in English. Most, almost all, things like this. Also, when you look out for negated quantifiers, this will be another important section. We'll talk a lot about this later. Excuse me, in this unit. Right, not all of you will pass, something like that. We'll get to them. Even though in English, take a word like most, quantify like most, it obviously means more than just there exists at least one. But for our logical purposes, we're only going to take two precise meanings, right? The meaning of the for all x, the universal quantifier, this one, and the existential quantifier, backwards e with the x, backwards e, x, and the precise logical meanings of them are, this means it's true of every single one, for all the things in the universe, for all x. This, there exists an x means it is true of at least one. And now they're the only quantifiers we're going to allow in our system, which means if you're translating an English quantifier like most, anything that falls short of all of them will just get the existential quantifier. So if you're asked to translate most of you will fail, you actually do there exists an x, fx. There exists an x such that x fails. Right? It's true, as Klenk explains, that you do cut short of the full meaning of the word most. What if I say most of you will fail? But we're only allowing these two quantifiers, so this is at least true. If most of you will fail, then it is also true that there exists an x such that x will fail, at least one of you will fail. So anything short of for all, even if it says almost all of you will fail, sorry to be using this example, we nonetheless translate this as, we use the existential quantifier to translate that. There exists an X such that X fails. Okay, so the first thing is learning to recognize quantifier expressions in English. Learning to recognize when a certain phrase or a bunch of words in English or single word in English is a quantifier. It is functioning as a quantifier. It is functioning to tell you of how many things the propositional function is true. So this is from exercise 1 at the end of unit 11. It's like, I think, ABC and then a couple from the end of question 1. The question asks you, and this is a typical question you'll get in quiz 4 is on this stuff. Quiz 4 is on unit 11 exclusively. Identify each of the following sentences as universal or existential. Pick out and abbreviate their propositional functions and symbolize them. So we'll do that in a minute. But let me define for you. So identify each as universal or existential. So what is a universal statement? What is an existential statement? So we start with the definitions of a universal quantifier and an existential quantifier. And then we get, that relies on and gets us to the other definition. So a universal quantifier is an expression which, when prefixed to a propositional function, yields a universal sentence. Okay, universal quantifier, so have a paradigm in your mind. Every, or everything, all, the word all, A-L-L. What is a universal quantifier? A universal quantifier is an expression which, when prefixed, put in front of, when prefixed to a propositional function, yields a universal sentence. What is a universal, yields a universal statement? What is a universal statement? A universal statement is a statement that says that a propositional function is true of everything. Okay, so this means every is a universal quantifier. Any is a universal quantifier, right? So on and so forth. Similar definitions for existential quantifier and existential quantifier. So you're thinking of, existential expression. That's right. No, existential quantifier. An existential quantifier is an expression which, when prefixed to a propositional function, yields an existential statement. And the definition of existential statement is a little less obvious than universal statement, but an existential statement is a statement which says that the propositional function is true of at least one thing. Okay? All right, so those are the definitions: universal quantifier, existential quantifier, universal statement, existential statement. So know those definitions. Okay, so let's determine what these things are and go ahead and symbolize them. So pick out the propositional function and then symbolize the sentence. And all these sentences are quantifier sentences. So they will be symbolized by the combination of a quantifier and a propositional function. And these are all simple quantified sentences, which means it will just be a simple propositional function, one capital letter and variable, combined with a quantifier to the left of it. But warning for the quizzes, right? You'll be often asked, you'll be given a whole bunch of sentences and propositional functions, and you'll be asked to pick out what's what. Remember, you can tell a propositional function by the presence of a variable. If it's, y is blue is what you're asked to determine what it is, that's a propositional function because it has the variable y, right? As in, not x, y, z, y is blue. That's the propositional function. It doesn't have a name, right? It has a variable. So that's, you can tell propositional function by the presence of variables. So I'm trying to fumble my way towards saying. Okay, let's do these. Some things are clear. So what's the logical analysis of this sentence? What is the propositional function? So some clearly is a existential quantifier, right? The propositional function is x is clear, right? So I'll do them all down here. So symbolization of the propositional function, this is just a cx, right, equals triple bar x is clear. That's the propositional function, right? So, and remember this is a quantifier statement, so it is attained the second of the two ways in which we attain sentences from propositional function. First way was to replace the individual variable with an individual constant, right? X is clear, let's say this book is clear, right? Let B be the individual constant referring to this book. Okay, so that's making a sentence. Right. This is incomplete. This is complete. You've made a complete sentence by substituting the individual constant B, which stands for this book, for the individual variable X. But we're not doing that way of completing sentences. We've got this incomplete propositional function, and we are making quantifier statements, right? So we are going the second way of making sentences from propositional functions, and that is by prefixing the propositional function with a quantifier. In this case, some things are clear. It's just this. There exists an X prefix. Quantifiers always go to the left of the propositional function, be it simple or complex. But that's it. That's the symbolization of this first one. Some things are clear. A lot of developing mastery of quantifiers is learning to read the symbolization in English, right? Especially saying the phrase "such that" at the right time, right? There exists an X such that X is clear. So read this, right? Klenk recommends doing 2 steps in translation. If you're going from symbolizations to English, when you're translating or reading the formula in symbols, translating into English, she recommends a 2-step process where first of all you give a literal reading of the symbols, right? So this you would read as there exists an X. You would write out in the first step there exists an X such that X is clear, right? And then in the second step you would give a more colloquial way of saying that, right? Which is what we have at the beginning. Some things are clear, or something is clear, right? And in quiz 4, the last 2 questions ask you to translate symbols back into English, and I recommend doing it in this 2-step